They said she came to trade herself for a roof. The old man whispered by the saloon door, and by sundown, the whole town believed it, because out here, a story didn't need truth. It just needed someone willing to repeat it. And when Ethan Cole heard those words carried across the dry wind, he didn't look up, didn't ask who said it, didn't even slow the steady rhythm of his hammer striking old wood, each hit echoing against the empty stretch of land like a man reminding himself that silence was safer than opinion, because he had learned that lesson the hard way, years ago, in a different town, with a different kind of promise that ended quieter than it began. But this wasn't about him. Not yet. This was about the woman walking alone across a mile of cracked earth, her shadow long behind her, her steps slow but certain, as if turning back had never been an option. The dust clung to her like it recognized her, like the land itself knew she belonged somewhere, just not here. And when she stopped 10 feet from Ethan's cabin, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of sage and dry leather. And for a moment, even the loose shutter on his window went still, like it was listening. She didn't lower her eyes, didn't fidget, didn't offer the kind of smile people used when they wanted something. Instead, she stood straight, shoulders tired but unbroken, and spoke with a calm that didn't ask permission. "I have no home. You have no wife." And the words landed between them, not soft, not sharp, just certain, like a fact that had already been decided somewhere neither of them could see. Ethan's hand paused midair, hammer hovering just above the nail, not because he was surprised, but because he understood something the others didn't. This wasn't a plea, not the kind he had heard before, not the kind that came with lowered voices and careful glances. This was something else, something older, something that didn't belong to the rules of this town or the whispers behind its doors. But still, he said nothing, because silence had kept him alive longer than kindness ever had. And across the road, 2 men leaned against the hitching post, watching with quiet amusement, waiting for the moment a story became real. One of them chuckled under his breath, nudging the other like they had already seen this ending play out a dozen times before. But the woman didn't move, didn't repeat herself, didn't step closer. She just stood there, letting the space between them breathe, and that space, that distance, held more weight than any words could carry, because in her world, crossing that line without invitation meant something you couldn't take back, and in his world, letting someone cross it meant something he wasn't sure he could afford again. The wind picked up, dragging a line of dust between them, thin as a blade, and still neither of them moved. And somewhere in that quiet, something shifted, not in the town, not in the watching eyes, but in the way Ethan's grip tightened just slightly around the hammer, like he was measuring not the wood in front of him, but the cost of answering a sentence that had no easy end. The hammer finally came down, not on the nail, but slowly to Ethan's side, like a man setting something aside he was not ready to use. And still he did not answer her, because words had a way of opening doors he had spent years keeping shut. Instead he turned, walked past her without brushing her shoulder, without even letting his sleeve touch hers, and stepped into the cabin, leaving the door open just enough to say something without saying it at all. And the woman remained where she stood, eyes following the shape of that doorway, not as an invitation, but as a test, because in her world, a doorway meant nothing unless the one inside chose to see you. And inside, Ethan moved through the dim light of a room that had not changed in years, a single table, a worn chair, a tin cup left where he had last set it down, everything in its place, everything untouched by anyone but him. The kind of stillness that only comes when a man stops expecting footsteps that never return. He reached for the cup, then stopped, his reflection faint in the dull metal, a face older than it should have been, marked not by time, but by decisions he could not take back. And outside, the wind shifted again, carrying with it the low murmur of voices from across the road. The men still watching, still waiting, because patience was easy when you believed the ending was already written. One of them leaned forward, calling out just loud enough to carry, "You going to leave her out there all night, Cole?" And the other laughed, not cruel, just certain, like this was all part of a story they had heard before. But Ethan did not respond, not to them, not to her, because this was not their moment to control. And when he stepped back to the doorway, she was still there, exactly where he had left her, not closer, not farther, as if time had moved around her but not through her. Her hands rested loosely at her sides, fingers still, no trembling, no sign of the cold beginning to creep into the air. And for the first time, Ethan noticed something most men would miss: the absence of desperation. She was not here because she had nowhere else to go. She was here because she had chosen this place, this moment, this man, and that realization settled heavier than any plea ever could, because choice meant responsibility, and responsibility meant risk, and he had buried enough risk to last a lifetime. "You should find shelter before dark," he said finally, his voice low, steady, offering distance instead of closeness. But she did not move, did not argue, did not even nod. She simply held his gaze and answered in the same calm tone, "I am not asking for shelter." And the difference between those words and what the town believed cut clean through the air, because asking meant giving up something, and she had not come here to lose anything else. A long silence followed, stretched thin by the sound of a loose board creaking under the wind, and somewhere behind Ethan, the faint tick of cooling metal from the stove marked time neither of them acknowledged, until she reached slowly into the fold of her worn shawl and brought out something small, something that caught the last light of the day. A piece of turquoise set in simple leather, worn smooth by years of being held. And she stepped forward just one pace, no closer, placing it carefully on the wooden post beside his door, not handing it to him, not forcing him to take it, just leaving it there like a marker between two worlds. And then she stepped back again, returning to that same distance, as if nothing had changed, but everything had, because now there was something between them that had weight. Something that did not belong to rumor or assumption, something real, and Ethan's eyes moved from her face to the small object resting in the fading light. And for a moment, something unfamiliar passed through him, not memory, not regret, but recognition of a choice that was no longer simple. And out beyond the ridge, unseen by both of them, a thin line of dust began to rise against the horizon, too far to hear, too quiet to notice, but moving steadily in their direction. The last light of the sun slipped behind the ridge, leaving the land in that quiet gray where shapes softened and truths became harder to ignore. And Ethan stood in the doorway longer than he meant to, eyes fixed on the small piece of turquoise resting on the post, as if it might explain itself if he waited long enough. But it did not. It just sat there, worn smooth by time, carrying a meaning he did not yet understand. And behind him the cabin felt smaller than usual, like the walls had shifted an inch closer when he was not looking, pressing him toward a decision he had no interest in making. Outside, she had not moved, not even to follow the fading warmth of the sun, her silhouette steady against the growing dark, and that stillness unsettled him more than any demand ever could, because stillness meant patience, and patience meant she believed time was on her side, a belief he had stopped trusting years ago. The wind picked up again, colder now, sliding through the gaps in the wood, brushing past his collar and into the room behind him. And for a moment, he almost closed the door, almost shut it all out the way he had done so many times before. But his hand stopped halfway, fingers resting against the rough edge of the frame, as if the wood itself held him there. And across the road, the men had not left, their voices lower now, less amused, more curious, because something about the silence between Ethan and the woman did not fit the ending they had expected. One of them shifted his weight, muttering something about stubbornness. The other just watched, eyes narrowed, like he was trying to understand a story that refused to follow its usual path. And then, without looking at them, without even turning his head, Ethan spoke again, not loud, not forceful, just enough to carry through the space between him and her. "You will not last the night out here." And it was not a warning, not quite concern, just a statement shaped by years of watching what the desert did to people who underestimated it. And she answered without hesitation, her voice steady, unchanged by the dropping temperature or the weight of his words. "I have lasted longer nights than this." And something in the way she said it, not proud, not defiant, just certain, made the air feel heavier, as if her past had stepped into the space beside her without needing to be named. Ethan's gaze shifted back to the turquoise, the way it caught what little light remained, and he stepped forward, just one pace, enough to reach it, his fingers closing around the leather cord. And the moment it touched his skin, Something unfamiliar settled in his chest, not memory, not quite recognition, but the sense that this was not a simple offering, not something given lightly or without meaning. He turned it over once, feeling the worn edges, the quiet weight of it, and then he looked back at her, really looked this time, not at the dust or the distance, but at the way she held herself, the way she had not asked twice, had not tried to cross the space he had left between them. And for the first time, he understood that whatever this was, it was not about filling an empty place. It was about choosing what stood beside it, and that choice, once made, did not leave room for halfway decisions. The sky darkened fully now, the first stars breaking through the fading light, and still the distance remained, unchanged, unbroken, until finally, Ethan stepped back, not away from her, but toward the cabin, placing the turquoise just inside the doorway instead of outside it, not accepting it, not rejecting it, just moving it across a line that only he seemed to recognize. And then he reached for the lantern, the soft glow spilling out into the night, stretching across the ground between them, stopping just short of her feet. And in that dim light, something shifted again, subtle, almost invisible, but enough that even the men across the road fell quiet. Because for the first time since she had arrived, the space between them no longer belonged entirely to silence. And far beyond the ridge, that thin line of dust had grown wider, closer now, moving with a purpose that did not depend on whether either of them was ready for what it carried. The lantern light flickered once, then steadied, casting a narrow path across the dirt that stopped just short of her boots, like a boundary drawn without words. And for a long moment, neither of them moved, because that thin line of light carried more weight than a door ever could. It was not an invitation, not yet, but it was no longer a refusal, and she understood that, not with relief, not with gratitude, but with a quiet acceptance that made her shoulders ease by the smallest measure, as if she had expected less and found something different instead, something harder to define. The wind slipped between them again, colder now, carrying the dry scent of nightfall, and she lowered herself slowly to the ground beside the cabin wall, not turning her back to him, not closing her eyes, just sitting, as if this place, this exact spot, had already been decided long before she arrived. And inside, Ethan set the lantern down on the table, its glow stretching across the worn boards. Touching the edges of a life that had not changed in years, he stood there for a while, hands resting at his sides, listening, not for danger, not for movement, but for something else, something he could not quite name. And what he heard was not silence, not entirely. It was the presence of another person just beyond his walls, steady, unmoving, not asking, not leaving, and that presence unsettled him more than noise ever had, because noise could be ignored, but this waited, and waiting had a way of asking questions a man could not outrun. He reached for the turquoise again, still resting just inside the doorway, turning it once more between his fingers, the leather worn smooth, the stone carrying a faint warmth that did not belong to the air. And he wondered, not for the first time, what kind of past led someone to carry a thing like this across miles of empty land just to leave it on a stranger's post, not as payment, not as proof, but as something closer to a promise, though he could not yet see what it promised. Outside, the men across the road had grown quiet, their earlier amusement replaced by something closer to unease, because the story they thought they understood had not moved forward the way it should have. There was no laughter, no easy conclusion, just a stillness that made them shift where they stood, unsure whether to stay or leave. And one of them finally muttered, low enough that it barely carried, "This is not how it goes." And the other did not answer, because he was watching the woman now, really watching her, the way she sat without curling into herself, without shrinking against the cold, as if the ground beneath her was not foreign, but chosen. And that choice, that quiet certainty, made something in the air feel different, like the land itself had taken notice. Ethan stepped back to the doorway again, stopping where the light met the dark, and for a second, just a second, it looked like he might say something more, something that would change the shape of the night. But instead, he did something smaller, something that would have gone unnoticed if anyone had been looking for grand gestures. He reached inside, took a second lantern, lit it from the first, and placed it on the ground just beyond the threshold, closer to where she sat, Not close enough to touch. Not close enough to erase the distance. But close enough that the darkness between them softened, and when he stepped back again, the space held two lights now. Not one. Two quiet markers in the night, neither claiming the other, both simply existing. And she looked at the second lantern for a moment, then back at him. And though her face did not change, though her posture remained the same, something in her eyes shifted, something that had nothing to do with need and everything to do with understanding. Because in her world, a man who shared light without taking anything in return was not weak. He was choosing a path most others avoided, and that choice carried weight, far more than words ever could, and far beyond the ridge. The faint line of dust had grown into shapes now, distant figures moving with steady purpose, not fast, not urgent, just certain, as if they already knew where they were going. And neither the man nor the woman by the cabin had any idea how close that certainty had come. The second lantern burned lower as the night settled fully over the land. Its glow softer now, less a statement and more a quiet agreement between two people who had not yet spoken enough to understand each other. And Ethan remained just inside the doorway, not sitting, not resting, just standing as if the act of stillness itself required effort, his eyes drifting again and again toward the shape of her against the cabin wall, the way she had not shifted position, not even to chase warmth, not even to ease the stiffness that must have begun creeping into her limbs. And that choice, that refusal to move closer to comfort, pressed against something in him he had spent years ignoring, because he recognized it, not in her, but in himself, the kind of stubbornness that came from losing something once and deciding never to reach for it again, the kind that built walls instead of bridges, because walls did not betray you. They just stood there, reliable in their silence. And yet here she was, not breaking that silence, not asking him to lower those walls, just existing beside them as if they were not meant to be permanent. And that thought unsettled him more than anything she had said, because permanence was the only thing he trusted anymore. Outside, the cold deepened, the kind that crept into the ground and stayed there. And still she remained, her breathing steady, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the immediate, as if she was listening to something the night carried that he could not hear. And after a long while, he stepped forward again, crossing the threshold this time, boots pressing into the dirt that held the warmth of the day just barely, and he stopped halfway between the two lanterns. The space between them now shared, not divided, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching not with tension, but with something closer to recognition, until finally, he broke it, his voice lower than before, not guarded, not open, just honest in a way he had not allowed himself in years. "That is not something you leave behind unless it matters," he said, nodding slightly toward the turquoise, and she followed his gaze, her eyes resting on the small object now inside his doorway. And when she spoke, her voice carried no pride, no attempt to impress, just the weight of truth spoken plainly. "It belonged to my grandmother," she said. "She wore it when she chose to trust a man outside her people." And the words settled between them, quiet but heavy, because trust was not something given lightly, not in her world, not in his. And he felt something shift again, deeper this time, something that reached past habit and into memory, not of the woman he had lost, but of the man he had been before losing her, the one who believed that trust was not weakness, but strength. And he had buried that man a long time ago, left him somewhere between disappointment and silence. But now, standing here with the cold pressing in and the lantern light holding just enough space to see clearly, he realized that maybe he had not buried him as deep as he thought, because something in him still recognized the weight of what she had placed on his doorstep, not as an offer, not as a trade, but as a statement, and statements did not ask for permission. They simply existed, and he found himself asking a question he had not intended to ask. And what happened to that man? And she did not look away, did not hesitate. He did not take what was offered, she said. He gave something instead. And there it was, the difference laid bare in a single sentence. Not ownership, not possession, but giving. And that word lingered longer than the others, because giving required something he had not allowed himself in years. It required risk, and risk meant opening a door he had worked too hard to close. And yet, as he stood there, halfway between distance and connection, he realized that The door had already shifted, just enough that closing it completely would take more effort than leaving it where it was. And far beyond the ridge, those distant figures had drawn closer still, their shapes clearer now against the night sky, moving not with urgency, but with certainty, as if they were following a path that had already been decided long before any of this began. The word lingered between them longer than the cold, longer than the silence, as if it had weight that neither of them could step around, and Ethan felt it settle somewhere deeper than he expected, not in his thoughts, but in the part of him that had learned to avoid decisions that could not be undone. And for a while, he said nothing, because answering her meant admitting something to himself, something he had not allowed in years. That giving was not the same as losing, and yet the memory of what it could cost remained sharp enough to keep his voice still. The lantern light flickered again, casting shifting shadows across the ground, turning the space between them into something that moved without either of them taking a step, and she watched him, not with expectation, not with pressure, just with that same quiet patience that had brought her here in the first place, as if she already understood that whatever he chose would come from within him, not from anything she said or did. And that understanding, more than anything else, made it harder for him to remain where he stood, because it removed the excuse of resistance. There was no demand to push against, no argument to win, just a choice waiting to be made, and choices, he knew, were the only things a man truly owned. He let out a slow breath, one he had not realized he was holding, and glanced once more toward the turquoise resting just inside his doorway, the small piece of another world now sitting in his, quiet, but undeniable, and he stepped back, not away from her, but toward the cabin, crossing the threshold fully this time, disappearing briefly into the dim interior, and for a moment, she remained alone in the lantern light, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, as if she had expected this, not as rejection, not as acceptance, just as part of the process that had already begun. The wind moved again, brushing past her shoulders, lifting a strand of her dark hair before letting it fall back into place, and somewhere in the distance, the faint rhythm of movement carried across the land, too soft to be called sound, but present enough to be felt, like something approaching with purpose. And then Ethan returned, not empty-handed, but carrying something simple, something worn, a folded blanket that had seen more seasons than most people in town. He did not speak as he stepped forward, did not offer explanation, just placed it on the ground between the two lanterns, closer to her side than his, and stepped back again, creating space once more. And that small act, quiet and without ceremony, shifted something in the air that even the watching men across the road could not ignore, because it was not ownership, not control, not even protection in the way they understood it. It was something else, something that did not fit the story they had expected to see unfold. And she looked at the blanket for a moment, then at him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes holding a new depth, something that acknowledged the gesture without diminishing it. And slowly, deliberately, she reached forward and took it, not as someone accepting charity, but as someone recognizing an offering made without condition. And she draped it over her shoulders, the fabric settling around her like a quiet agreement. And for the first time since she had arrived, she shifted her position slightly, not closer to him, not farther away, just enough to acknowledge that something between them had moved, even if neither of them had named it. And Ethan watched that movement, small as it was, and felt the weight of it settle into place, because he understood now that this was no longer about whether she would stay the night. It was about what came after, about what it meant to let someone remain once the sun rose again. And that was a question he had not yet answered, not for her, not for himself. And far beyond the ridge, the shapes in the distance had drawn close enough to catch the faintest glint of moonlight, revealing figures on horseback, steady, unhurried, moving toward the only place in that stretch of land where two lanterns still burned against the dark. The blanket settled around her shoulders like something more than fabric, like a line quietly redrawn in the dirt. And Ethan felt that shift without needing to name it, because some changes did not arrive with sound. They arrived with stillness, the kind that made a man realize the ground beneath him was no longer the same as it had been an hour ago. And he stood there, just outside his own door, hands empty now, as if he had already given more than he intended and had not yet decided if that was a mistake. The lantern light cast long shadows behind him, stretching across the yard, touching the edge of the road where the two men still lingered, their voices gone quiet, their earlier certainty replaced by something closer to unease. Because nothing about this moment matched the story they had been ready to repeat. There was no claim, no transaction, no easy ending they could carry back into town. Just a man who had stepped into the space between distance and connection and refused to turn it into something simple, and a woman who had not once asked him to. And that kind of silence made people uncomfortable, because it left no place to stand. The night deepened, the cold settling into the ground like it intended to stay. And still the two lanterns burned, their light steady now, not flickering, not uncertain, just present. And in that presence, Ethan noticed something he had not allowed himself to notice before. The way her breathing had slowed, the way her shoulders had dropped just enough to show the smallest measure of rest. Not because she felt safe, not because she trusted him, but because she had made her choice and was willing to stand inside it, whatever it brought. And that kind of resolve was not something he had seen often, not in this town, not in the years since he had chosen to live apart from it. And it stirred something in him that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with recognition, because once, a long time ago, he had known what it meant to stand on a choice and not step back from it. And he had paid the price for that, a price that had taught him to keep his distance, to measure every action by what it might cost. And now here he was again, standing on the edge of something he could not yet see the end of, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. A faint sound carried across the land then, not loud, not urgent, but steady, the distant rhythm of hooves meeting hard ground. And it reached him before it reached anyone else, because he was the only one. Still listening for things that mattered, his head turned slightly, eyes narrowing toward the ridge, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow with him, the lantern light behind, the dark ahead, and something moving between them, not fast, not hidden, just coming. And he did not move toward it, did not reach for anything, just watched, because reacting too soon was a mistake he had learned to avoid. And beside the cabin wall, she had heard it too, her head lifting just enough to catch the sound, her gaze shifting past him, not with fear, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet certainty that told him she had been expecting this, not hoping for it, not dreading it, just knowing it would come. And that knowledge settled between them like another unspoken truth, because whatever was approaching, it did not belong to him alone, and it did not belong to her alone either. It belonged to the space they had created between them, the one marked by lantern light and distance, by a blanket offered without claim and a stone left without demand. And as the sound grew clearer, as the shapes at the edge of the ridge began to take form against the night sky, Ethan felt something shift inside him again. Not hesitation this time, not doubt, but something closer to decision, the kind that did not ask for permission, the kind that simply arrived when a man realized that standing still was no longer enough. And without looking at her, without speaking, he stepped forward, not toward the road, not toward the approaching riders, but toward the empty stretch of land just beside his cabin, the ground untouched, unclaimed, and he paused there, just for a second, as if measuring something. Only he could see, before lowering his gaze to the dirt beneath his boots, the place where the next move would begin. The ground beneath Ethan's boots was hard, packed by years of sun and silence, the kind of land that did not change easily. And yet he stood there as if measuring something that had nothing to do with soil or stone, his gaze fixed on a stretch of earth no one in town had ever paid attention to, a narrow strip running alongside his cabin, too small to matter, too close to be separate. And for a long moment, he did not move. The sound of distant hooves growing clearer behind him, the presence of the woman steady at his back, the lantern light holding its quiet line between what was and what might become. And then, without a word, he turned and stepped inside the cabin once more, leaving the door open, leaving the light behind him. And she watched him go, not with confusion, not with doubt, but with that same patience that had brought her here, because whatever he was about to do, it was not something that needed to be rushed inside. The cabin shifted with his movement, the floorboards creaking under weight that had not changed in years, and he moved with purpose now, not hesitation, reaching for tools he had not used in a long while, a worn measuring line, a small bundle of stakes, things that spoke not of defense, not of protection, but of building. And when he stepped back out into the night, those tools in his hands caught the lantern light just enough to reveal intent, not loud, not declared, but unmistakable. And the men across the road straightened where they stood, their curiosity sharpening into something closer to disbelief. Because this was not how the story was supposed to unfold. Not here, not with him. Ethan Cole did not build for others, did not change what was his. And yet there he was, walking past the edge of his own doorway, past the line that had held him apart for years, and stopping at that narrow stretch of land, the one no one had claimed, not even him. And he drove the first stake into the ground with a single, measured strike, the sound carrying farther than it should have in the quiet night, sharp, clear, undeniable. And she felt it more than heard it, her gaze shifting to him, not questioning, not interrupting, just watching as he placed the second stake, then the third, each one marking something that had not existed before, something that did not belong to the past he had been holding on to. And the rhythm of his movement settled into the air, steady, deliberate, not hurried, not uncertain, just a man doing what he had decided needed to be done. And the approaching riders slowed as they drew nearer, their shapes now visible against the dim rise of the ridge, silhouettes that carried no urgency, no threat, just presence, as if they too understood that whatever was happening here had already begun before they arrived, and would not be altered by their timing. And still Ethan worked, measuring, marking, defining a space that had not been given a name, not yet. And when he paused, it was not to look at the riders, not to acknowledge the watching men across the road, but to look at the woman, just for a second, long enough to make something clear without speaking, that this was not for him alone, and not for her alone either. It was for what stood between them, and she held his gaze, steady, understanding passing through her eyes like a quiet current, because she recognized this act for what it was, not an acceptance of her, not a refusal, but something deeper, something that gave without taking, that created without claiming. And the final stake went into the ground with a softer sound. The line complete, the space defined, and Ethan stepped back, tools still in his hands, his breath even, his posture unchanged, as if he had simply finished a task he had always meant to do. And behind him, the lanterns burned on, their light now touching that marked ground as well, no longer stopping at the edge, no longer held back. And the riders came to a halt at the far end of the yard, silent, watching, not speaking, because they did not need to. The meaning of what had been done lay clear in the earth itself, in the line drawn not to divide, but to give shape to something new. And in that quiet, with the night settled fully around them, Ethan Cole had already made his answer, not in words, not in claims, but in the only language that could not be mistaken, the kind that stayed long after the sound of hooves had faded. The last stake stood quiet in the earth, its shadow stretching thin beneath the lantern light. And for a moment, nothing moved, not the wind, not the men across the road, not even the horses standing still at the edge of the yard, because something had already been decided without a word spoken, and everyone there could feel it, even if they could not explain it. Ethan lowered the tools in his hands, letting them rest at his side, not dropping them, not holding them tight, just letting them exist the way everything else in that moment seemed to exist, without force, without demand. And he did not turn to face the riders right away, did not acknowledge their presence with the kind of attention most men would give, because whatever they had come for, it had already been answered before they arrived. And when he finally did look up, his gaze passed over them not as a challenge, not as a question, just as recognition. The same way a man might look at the horizon, knowing it was there, but not needing to claim it. And the riders did not move closer, did not speak. They simply sat where they had stopped, their outlines steady against the dark, their silence carrying more weight than any greeting could have, because they understood what had been done. They understood the line in the dirt, the space that had been marked not as possession, but as respect. And that understanding settled over the yard like something older than the town, older than the stories the men across the road had been telling all evening. And those men shifted now, uncertain, their earlier confidence gone, because there was no place left for their version of events, no simple ending they could carry back into the noise of the saloon, just a quiet that refused to fit into anything they recognized. and beside the cabin wall, she rose slowly to her feet, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. The lantern light catching the edges of the fabric, softening the lines of her figure, and she stepped forward, not toward Ethan, not toward the riders, but toward that marked ground, the space that had not existed an hour ago and now stood defined by intention alone. And she paused at its edge, looking down at the stakes, at the line drawn without words, and then she stepped across it, not with hesitation, not with ceremony, just a single, deliberate movement that said more than anything she could have spoken. And Ethan watched that step, felt the weight of it settle into place. Because that was the moment the choice became real, not his alone, not hers alone, but something shared, something that could not be taken back without breaking what had just been created. And he did not follow her, did not cross that line himself. He remained where he stood, giving her the space he had marked, not claiming it, not entering it, just allowing it to exist as its own. And that restraint, that decision to stay back, carried more meaning than stepping forward ever could. And she moved a few paces into the space, then stopped, her gaze lifting toward the riders. And for the first time since they had appeared, one of them inclined his head, a small gesture, almost unnoticeable, but enough to acknowledge what had been done, enough to recognize the choice that had been made without needing to question it. And then, just as quietly as they had arrived, the riders turned their horses, not in retreat, not in dismissal, but in acceptance, their silhouettes shifting against the night as they began to move away, the sound of hooves returning to the distance they had come from, steady, unhurried, as if they had only needed to see what had already been decided, and nothing more. And the yard grew still again, the lanterns burning low now, their light softer, less defined, but still present. And Ethan remained where he was, tools at his side, eyes on the ground that now held a meaning it had not held before. And after a long moment, he turned back toward the cabin, not closing the door behind him, not shutting out the night, just stepping inside and leaving the space as it was. And outside, she stood within the boundary he had given, the blanket around her shoulders, the quiet of the land settling around her like something she had been searching for. And after a while, she reached into the folds of that blanket, her hand closing around something small, something familiar. And she walked back to the doorway, not crossing it, not stepping inside, just stopping where the light met the dark, and gently, carefully, she placed the turquoise on the ground between them, not outside, not inside, but exactly on that line. And when she stepped back again, there was no need for words, because the meaning had already found its place, not as an offer this time, not as a question, but as an answer that neither of them would ever need to speak.